Welcome to the Concierge Care Health System podcast. The information shared in this podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. Listeners should be aware the content is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult with a physician or other qualified healthcare provider for medical questions.
We often focus on, what we eat or how much we exercise, and rightly so. But what about the air we breathe, the water we drink, or even the sounds that are just constantly around us? What if these external forces are quietly, profoundly shaping the very core of who we are, our brains? Today we're taking a deep dive into something really, really important. The often hidden impact of our environment on neurological health.
It really can be hidden, can it? It's not always obvious.
Exactly. And we're talking about everything from that nagging brain fog most of us get sometimes, to the really serious risks of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, and even neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD and ASD.
What quickly becomes clear, I think, as we explore this is just how broad the definition of environment really is. It's not just the pollution we typically think of, smog or something. It encompasses this huge array of non-genetic factors, things like chemicals, physical agents, climate, and even those lifestyle choices that are so deeply shaped by our surroundings, where we live, what we have access to. When you connect this to the bigger picture, it really highlights how intimately our brain health is woven into the fabric of the world we live in.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've got a stack of fascinating sources today. We've looked at scientific reports, public health analyses. Our mission here is to kind of cut through the complexity, pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge for you, and help you understand what's truly at stake. And crucially, what might actually be preventable. Okay, so let's unpack this. Our human nervous system. It's incredibly complex, right? It's the master controller for everything from our thoughts and emotions to our internal metabolism. But despite all that sophistication, it's also remarkably vulnerable to what researchers call environmental insults. Insults, yeah.
And the damage can range from those subtle cognitive deficits, like that occasional brain fog we mentioned, to far more severe conditions, things like dementia, paralysis, or even in extreme cases, a coma. Now, while our genetics certainly play a role in neurological diseases, we know that there's this rapidly growing recognition that external non-genetic factors are significantly contributing to the rising rates and development of many of these conditions.
Yeah, the emphasis is really shifting or maybe expanding.
It feels urgent, doesn't it, when you consider the increasing prevalence of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and just the substantial global burden of neurological disorders overall.
And this brings us right back to that expansive definition of environment. It really does extend far beyond simple outdoor air or water pollution. Think about chemical contaminants in our everyday air, the water we drink, the food we eat. Then there are occupational hazards, what people are exposed to at work, physical agents like radiation, lifestyle factors like diet and physical activity, which, again, are shaped by our surroundings. All right, like, do you live near a park? Is there healthy food available?
Exactly. And climate-related phenomena, even ambient noise levels in our neighborhoods. So given that the nervous system has a very limited capacity for neuronal regeneration, meaning brain cells don't really replace themselves easily after development, what does this tell us about prevention?
It sounds like it's everything.
It tells us prevention is absolutely paramount. Because once the damage is done, it's often irreversible.
Okay, irreversible. That's a key point. So with that in mind, what exactly are these environmental factors, and how do they actually impact our brains? This is where we start to see some clearer connections, I think. Let's start with something many of us encounter every single day: air pollution. For a long time, we thought of it mainly in terms of, lungs or heart issues.
Respiratory, cardiovascular, yeah.
But now it's emerging as a major kind of invisible threat to neurological health. We're primarily talking about fine particulate matter that's known as PM2.5 and nitrogen dioxide, or NO2, both frequently linked to things like vehicle emissions and industrial activity.
And PM2.5 is especially dangerous precisely because it's so incredibly tiny. We're talking less than 2.5 micrometers in diameter. These microscopic particles, they can penetrate deep into our lungs, slip right into our bloodstream, and then make their way to the brain, either through our circulatory system or even, potentially, directly via the olfactory nerve from the nasal cavity.
Wow. So they can just sort of bypass the normal routes.
It's like these tiny invaders are getting a direct pathway into our neural command center.
And the list of neurological issues linked to PM2.5 exposure.
Yeah.
Well, it's growing. We're seeing strong associations with cognitive decline, things impacting memory, concentration, and yes, even that generalized brain fog in both adults and children.
Which is particularly concerning for development.
Absolutely. And there's also an increased risk or exacerbation of serious neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and stroke. What's maybe even more concerning is this emerging evidence linking it to mood disorders, depression, and potentially neurodevelopmental disorders like autism spectrum disorder and ADHD, particularly in children.
What these findings really reveal is that these pollutants aren't just causing superficial problems, it's deeper. MRI studies, for instance, have shown actual structural brain changes. Things like atrophy, a shrinking of brain tissue in people with higher PM2.5 exposure, and sometimes these changes occur even before any clinical signs of dementia appear.
So damage is happening silently.
It seems that way. And nitrogen dioxide, that NO2, often from vehicle exhaust, has also been linked to cognitive decline, especially in older adults, and may contribute to those long-term neurodegenerative processes. This all suggests these pollutants are impacting really fundamental brain processes across our entire lifespan, from childhood development to aging.
Okay, so beyond the air we breathe, our environment is, well, it's permeated by chemical neurotoxicants. Now, neurotoxicity, that simply means the ability of a substance to cause harmful changes to our nervous system, right?
Yeah.
Either its function or structure.
That's right, adverse changes.
And given that potential for irreversible damage we talked about, a core principle of public health is to identify these hazards before they become widespread human exposures. Ideally.
Ideally, yes, that's the goal.
So one major category we need to get into is pesticides. The concern here seems particularly high during critical developmental windows pregnancy, early childhood.
Definitely. That's when the brain is developing so rapidly.
But we're talking about certain common classes of these chemicals, things like organophosphates or maybe organochlorines, names people might have heard.
Now, studies have reported associations. For instance, connections between certain pesticide metabolites and attention problems, or maybe lower IQ scores, or even links between living near agricultural pesticide use and autism risk. But here's the tricky part. Human evidence can be complex. It's often inconsistent.
Why is that?
Well, it's just hard to definitively prove direct cause and effect with low-level chronic exposures. Think about accurately measuring someone's exposure over years. Plus, controlling for all the other factors in their life, diet, genetics, other exposures, it's tough.
Right. And animal studies.
Animal studies are valuable, but they often use much higher doses than what people typically encounter day to day. That said, long-term exposure to certain pesticides has been epidemiologically linked to an increased risk of Parkinson's disease, and that's a serious concern.
Okay. Then there are industrial chemicals and solvents, a truly vast category, it sounds like. Things like PCBs, which were used in coolants years ago, or PAHs, which come from burning things like car exhaust.
Right, incomplete combustion.
And also many common solvents like trichloroethylene or TCE. Exposure to these, especially during development, seems to be linked to impaired learning, memory issues, IQ deficits, and behavioral problems like inattention and impulsiveness.
Yeah, and the impact of solvents can range quite a bit, from acute central nervous system depression, basically slowing down brain activity right after exposure, to chronic cognitive impairment with long-term exposure. There's even a potential increase in the risk for neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's down the line. And what's truly unsettling, I think, is a stark fact from the U.S. EPA. Thousands of chemicals currently in commerce lack adequate testing for neurodevelopmental effects. We simply don't know the full extent of their impact on the developing brain.
Thousands. That's quite a gap in knowledge.
It's a significant data gap.
Okay, another class we need to understand. Endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs. These are chemicals that essentially interfere with our body's hormonal systems. You might know bisphenol A, BPA, found in some plastics, or phthalates, also used as plasticizers.
Those are common examples, yes.
And hormones, as you can imagine, play absolutely crucial roles in brain development and function. They're like chemical messengers guiding growth and activity.
Exactly. So when EDCs come into play, especially during early development, they can disrupt these really delicate hormonal processes. This potentially leads to altered brain function, behavioral changes. Some studies link aggression, hyperactivity, or anxiety to BPA exposure, or impaired concentration and motor function linked to phthalates. It might also increase susceptibility to neurological diseases later in life.
How do they do that? What's the mechanism?
Well, they can work in different ways. Sometimes they mimic natural hormones, tricking the body. Sometimes they block hormone receptors. Or they might alter how hormones are made or broken down. The real hurdle here, as with many chemicals, is definitively linking those low, everyday ambient levels we all encounter to specific long-term outcomes in humans. It's difficult research, which means we often need to adopt a precautionary approach.
Right. Better safe than sorry when the stakes are this high. Okay, next up, heavy metals. These are incredibly well-documented neurotoxicants. People have probably heard of some. Lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium.
Manganese, aluminum, nickel. Yeah, the list goes on.
And they can enter our bodies through the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink, even skin contact sometimes. Sources like industrial pollution, mining, agriculture, maybe older infrastructure like lead pipes.
A critical feature here is their tendency to bioaccumulate.
Meaning they build up.
Exactly. Imagine them like tiny, persistent invaders that your body absorbs faster than it can get rid of. They build up in your tissues, including your brain. They can bind to proteins, get stored in fat cells, or even deposited in bone like lead replacing calcium. So even small ongoing exposures can add up to significant levels over time.
Okay, so while many metals pose a threat, you mentioned lead and mercury stand out for their, well, devastating impact.
They do. Lead, for instance, is especially damaging to the developing nervous system. It's a major public health concern. Childhood exposure is linked to irreversible cognitive impairments, reduced IQ, learning disabilities, behavioral problems.
Irreversible again.
Yes.
Right.
And there are even links to Alzheimer's pathology later in life and an increased risk for ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease.
And mercury.
Mercury, particularly methylmercury, which we often get from contaminated fish, readily crosses the blood-brain barrier. High levels can cause severe damage. Think of the historical Minamata disease disaster in Japan. Prenatal exposure, even at lower levels, can impair visual processing. It's also associated with cognitive decline, memory loss, motor difficulties later on.
And the other metals, arsenic, cadmium.
They all contribute too through various pathways. Arsenic is a developmental neurotoxin linked to cognitive effects, maybe promoting tau misfolding seen in Alzheimer's. Cadmium can promote protein misfolding too and is toxic to glial cells. Manganese, especially excess from occupational exposure, causes a Parkinsonism-like syndrome. Aluminum's role in Alzheimer's is still under investigation, but it's found co-localized with plaques and tangles. Nickel also shows neurotoxic effects.
You mentioned glial cells there. What's their role?
Ah, that's crucial. Glial cells like microglia and astrocytes are the brain's supportive cells. They aren't just helpers, they're vital. They protect neurons, clean up waste, provide nutrients, form myelin insulation around nerve fibers. And what's concerning is how vulnerable these supportive cells are to metal-induced damage. Their disruption leads to neuroinflammation, impairs neuronal support, can cause demyelination, essentially stripping the insulation from nerves. All of this drives potent and long-lasting neurological effects.
Okay, moving to an even broader scale now. Climate change. This is emerging as a significant and, well, growing threat to neurological health, isn't it?
Absolutely. It acts as what researchers often call a threat multiplier.
Meaning
Meaning it takes existing vulnerabilities and makes them worse, while also layering new risks on top.
how does that work? What are the impacts?
Well, they're both direct and indirect. Directly, think about rising temperatures, increased humidity, and more frequent extreme weather events. Heat waves, floods, storms, wildfires. These have clear physiological consequences. Extreme heat, for example, can disrupt sleep, which is vital for brain health. It can trigger seizures in people with epilepsy and contribute to cognitive decline, especially in older adults.
And heat stroke itself is obviously a neurological emergency.
Precisely. High temperatures also increase cardiovascular strain, dehydration, blood coagulability, all of which are linked to increased stroke incidence and mortality, particularly for those with pre-existing conditions. We also see it worsening symptoms for people with multiple sclerosis and increasing hospital admissions for dementia during heat waves.
Okay, those are the direct impacts. What about indirect?
Indirectly, climate change affects neurological health through, for instance, the psychological distress from experiencing extreme weather events or worrying about the future. That means increased stress, anxiety, worry, which can contribute to cognitive impairment over time. And very importantly, climate change often worsens air quality. Think increased ground-level ozone during heat waves, or more particulate matter from wildfires.
Right, linking back to what we discussed earlier about air pollution.
Exactly, and that further increases risks for stroke, cognitive impairment, and can exacerbate conditions like ALS.
And this issue, like many environmental ones, doesn't impact everyone equally, does it?
Not at all. The burden of these climate-related neurological impacts falls disproportionately heavily on vulnerable populations. That includes people in low-income countries, the elderly, children, and individuals with pre-existing health conditions.
So the implications are pretty clear. We need responses on multiple levels.
Yes. Effective responses require both global climate mitigation efforts reducing emissions and targeted adaptation strategies to protect people right now, helping communities cope.
Okay. Beyond these major categories, air pollution, chemicals, metals, climate, are there other environmental factors playing a role?
There are. We should briefly touch on noise pollution.
Just unwanted sound, like traffic.
Yeah, that unwanted sound from traffic, industry, construction. It's not just annoying, it's linked to stress, anxiety, depression, and significant sleep disturbances, all of which indirectly impact neurological well-being. But there also seem to be direct links emerging with cognitive impairment, especially affecting children's development and academic performance. And it's linked to cardiovascular issues, which, as we know, are major risk factors for neurological conditions like stroke.
Interesting. What about lifestyle factors like diet and activity? We usually think of those as personal choices.
We do, but they are heavily influenced by our external environment. Well, think about it. Your access to affordable, healthy food options, or safe and appealing spaces for walking or exercising those, are environmentally determined. A nutrient-rich diet, regular physical activity, even adequate sunlight exposure for vitamin D. These all fundamentally support brain health. Conversely, environmental constraints, food deserts, unsafe neighborhoods can contribute to poor diet and inactivity, negatively impacting brain function.
So the environment shapes the choices available to us.
Precisely. And one last area is infections. Environmental conditions play a big role in the transmission of infections. Climate change, for instance, can alter the geographic ranges of disease vectors like mosquitoes and ticks.
Meaning more exposure to things like West Nile virus or Lyme disease?
Potentially, yes, in new areas. And water contamination, of course, can lead to pathogens that have direct neurological consequences.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of different threats. How do they all actually hurt our brains? Is there a common way they work?
That's a great question. What's remarkable is that despite the wide variety of agents we've discussed, pollutants, metals, chemicals, they often seem to converge on a limited number of common biological pathways within the nervous system. The brain's high energy requirements, its limited ability to replace damaged cells, and its delicate chemical signaling systems all make it uniquely susceptible to these kinds of disruptions.
Okay, so let's get into the how. What are these shared mechanisms? How do different exposures lead to similar kinds of damage?
Right, we can break down some of the key pathways.
First up, I see oxidative stress. What is that exactly?
Think of it like biological rusting at the cellular level. It happens when there's an imbalance between highly reactive molecules called free radicals or reactive oxygen species, ROS, and your body's antioxidant defenses that normally neutralize them.
And these environmental things increase the rust.
Exactly. Air pollutants, heavy metals, some pesticides can either generate more ROS or deplete your body's protective antioxidants. This excess then damages vital cellular components, lipids, proteins, even DNA, and this contributes significantly to neuroinflammation and is heavily implicated in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's.
Okay, that leads into the second one, neuroinflammation.
Right. This is essentially the activation of the brain's own immune cells, microglia and astrocytes. Now, acute inflammation can be protective, like after an injury, but chronic neuroinflammation triggered by persistent environmental exposures like pollutants or metals becomes incredibly damaging.
How so?
It's like a constant low-level fire burning in the brain. It leads to neuronal dysfunction, the loss of crucial connections between brain cells, synapses, and eventually even cell death. There's even talk of a lung-brain axis where inflammation starting in your lungs from breathing polluted air can send signals to your brain, triggering or worsening neuroinflammation there.
Wow, a direct connection. Okay, third, blood-brain barrier disruption. You mentioned this barrier before.
Yes, it's like the brain's highly selective security gate, a protective shield controlling what gets into the brain from the bloodstream. But certain environmental exposures, air pollution, heavy metals like aluminum and lead can compromise this gate's integrity.
Make it leaky. And then bad stuff gets in.
Potentially neurotoxic substances, inflammatory cells, other harmful molecules can sneak into the brain, fueling even more inflammation and damage. It compromises the brain's protected environment.
Number 4, mitochondrial dysfunction. These are the cell's power plants.
Exactly. Mitochondria generate the energy cells need to function. Neurons, brain cells have particularly high energy demands. This makes them super vulnerable when mitochondria are impaired by things like metals, pesticides, or air pollution.
What happens then?
When these power plants falter, it leads to energy depletion, increased oxidative stress, linking back to the first point, and ultimately cell death. Mitochondrial dysfunction is very strongly implicated in neurodegenerative diseases, especially Parkinson's.
Okay. Fifth pathway. Neurotransmitter system interference. This sounds fundamental.
It really is. Normal brain function relies on precise chemical signaling via neurotransmitters, the brain's messengers like dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine. Toxicants can disrupt this whole process, their synthesis, their release, how they bind to receptors, or how they're broken down and cleared away.
So it just scrambles the brain's communication system.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And that raises the fundamental question. If our brain's messaging system is scrambled, how profoundly does that impact our cognitive abilities, our behavior, our motor skills? The answer is likely, quite profoundly.
Sixth, protein misfolding and aggregation. This comes up a lot with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's.
Yes, it's a defining characteristic. Proteins like amyloid beta and tau in Alzheimer's, or alpha-synuclein in Parkinson's, they need to fold into specific 3D shapes to work properly. When they misfold, they can clump together, forming those characteristic plaques and tangles, or Lewy bodies. And there's emerging evidence showing that certain environmental exposures, like heavy metals, might promote these misfolding processes.
So the environment could actually kickstart that clumping process.
It could interfere with proper folding or the clearance of misfolded proteins. It's like complex origami going wrong inside your brain cells, potentially triggered or worsened by external factors.
Seventh pathway, epigenetic modifications. This sounds complicated.
It's about changes that affect how our genes work without changing the underlying DNA sequence itself. Think of them like dimmer switches on our genes, turning them up or down.
Okay.
Heavy metals, BPA, pesticides, phthalates, many of the things we've discussed can induce these epigenetic modifications. This can lead to long-lasting changes in gene expression patterns, and this is incredibly relevant for brain development and disease susceptibility later in life.
So early exposure could change gene activity for years.
Potentially, yes. It might help explain how exposures early in life can cast such a long shadow and manifest as problems decades later. It's a mechanism for long-term impact.
And finally, you mentioned endocrine disruption again here.
Yes, because those EDCs we discussed interfere with hormones that are critical not just for development, but for ongoing brain function. This disruption can lead to lasting neurological and behavioral consequences, especially when exposure happens during those sensitive developmental windows. What's really crucial to understand, though, is that these pathways rarely act in isolation. They're incredibly interconnected.
How so?
Well, mitochondrial dysfunction, for example, can lead to increased oxidative stress. Oxidative stress then fuels neuroinflammation. Neuroinflammation, in turn, can contribute to damaging the blood-brain barrier.
Ah, so it's a cascade.
Exactly. It's a complex cascading effect. And the flip side is that means interventions targeting one key node, say reducing oxidative stress or inflammation, might actually offer broader neuroprotective benefits across the board.
Okay, that makes sense. So knowing all this, who is most vulnerable? And are there specific times in our lives when we're particularly at risk?
Absolutely. There are definitely periods of heightened sensitivity. The developing nervous system from gestation right through early childhood exhibits a profound sensitivity to these environmental insults. During these critical windows, incredibly complex and tightly regulated processes are happening at an astonishing rate. Things like neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons, and synaptogenesis, the formation of those vital connections between them.
So exposure during that time is especially bad.
Yes. The consequences of exposure to neurotoxicants like heavy metals, pesticides, air pollutants, EDCs during these sensitive windows can be immediate and severe. It can lead to structural abnormalities in the brain or functional deficits that manifest as neurodevelopmental disorders, things like ASD, ADHD, intellectual disability, or maybe a lower IQ.
And these effects, are they always obvious right away?
Not necessarily. And that's a key point. The effects of early life exposure aren't always immediately apparent. They can increase susceptibility to disorders that only emerge much later in life. This concept is known as developmental neurotoxicity, or DNT. It essentially means that impacts on brain development early on can cast a lifetime shadow, making the brain more vulnerable down the road.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do we adequately protect future generations if the full impact of an exposure might not be seen for decades?
That is the million-dollar question in developmental toxicology and prevention.
And what about the other end of life? Aging?
As we age, our vulnerability also increases. Age-related declines in our body's natural resilience mechanisms kick in. Things like reduced antioxidant capacity, subtle changes in immune function, maybe a slightly less robust blood-brain barrier. All this can lower the threshold for environmental exposures to trigger or accelerate neurodegenerative processes.
So the wear and tear of life makes us more susceptible.
In a way, yes, and the cumulative burden of a lifetime of these various environmental exposures contributes significantly to the age-related risk of diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. It's almost like those early developmental exposures can prime the nervous system, making it more susceptible to the challenges it faces later in life, including aging itself.
Of course, our individual genetic makeup plays a role too, right?
Absolutely. We can't ignore genetics. Our individual genetic code influences how susceptible we are. Genes can affect how efficiently toxicants are metabolized and removed from our bodies, or how robust our body's natural defense and repair systems are.
So it's nature and nurture.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating, and where a lot of cutting-edge research is focused, is understanding that many common neurological disorders are likely thought to arise from complex interactions between multiple genetic factors and various environmental triggers. It's not just one gene or one exposure, but the interplay between them. Identifying these intricate gene-environment interactions is a critical area of ongoing research.
And we have to acknowledge the socioeconomic factors and disparities here too.
Vitally important. The risks from environmental neurotoxicants are often distributed incredibly inequitably. Low-income communities, agricultural workers, people in certain industrial jobs frequently face significantly higher levels of exposure to pollutants, pesticides, or solvents.
And it's not just the exposure itself.
No, it's often exacerbated by other factors that cluster with lower socioeconomic status. Things like inadequate housing, offering less protection from extreme weather or noise pollution, poorer nutrition, which might reduce resilience, limited access to quality health care, and often higher levels of chronic psychosocial stress, which itself impacts brain health.
This is a multiplier effect again in a different way.
It really is. And this underscores the critical need for environmental justice considerations in all our public health policies and research.
So taking all this together, what it really highlights is this life course perspective, right?
Yeah.
Our neurological health isn't just shaped at one point in time. It's molded across our entire lifespan, from conception onwards. And those early exposures can potentially cast very, very long shadows.
That's a perfect summary. And understanding this incredibly complex interplay between environment, genetics, and time requires robust research. But as you might guess, that research also faces some significant hurdles.
Right. So for the scientists trying to untangle all these complex threads, what are the big roadblocks? What makes this so difficult to study?
Well, first and foremost, establishing clear causality, proving that exposure X caused disease Y, is notoriously difficult in humans.
Why is that?
Think about the long latency periods. Exposure might happen in childhood, but the disease doesn't show up until late adulthood. How do you connect those dots definitively? Plus, we're usually exposed to complex mixtures of chemicals, not just single agents one at a time. How do you tease apart the effects of the mixture?
Right. The real world isn't a controlled lab experiment.
Exactly. There are countless confounding factors: lifestyle, diet, genetics, other health conditions. And of course, there are huge ethical constraints on deliberately exposing people to potential toxins in experiments.
And just measuring exposure must be hard too.
Incredibly hard, accurately assessing an individual's low-level chronic exposures over decades. It's a massive challenge. How much were you exposed to 20 years ago? How do we measure that reliably now?
Yeah, I can see that.
And then there's the issue of mixtures. We know people are exposed to multiple chemicals simultaneously, but the combined effects, whether they're additive or synergistic, are largely understudied. There's also uncertainty about the effects of chronic, low-level exposures, doses below what causes obvious acute toxicity. And maybe the most staggering fact ties back to what we mentioned earlier. A vast number of chemicals currently in commerce simply lack adequate neurotoxicity testing. One estimate suggested less than 1% have been fully evaluated for their potential to cause developmental neurotoxicity.
Less than 1%. Wow. So we're flying blind on a lot of this stuff.
There are significant data gaps, yes. And that's why there's a major push towards new approach methodologies, or NAMs.
NMs. What are those?
They represent a necessary shift in how we evaluate chemical safety. These approaches are designed to be faster, more cost-effective, and critically, potentially more relevant to human biology than some traditional methods.
Okay, so what do these new approaches look like? Give us some examples.
Sure. One big area is high-throughput in vitro screening. This uses automated robotic systems to rapidly test large numbers of chemicals on cultured neural cells, looking for effects like cell death, impaired neuron growth, or changes in neural network activity.
So testing on cells in a dish, but on a massive scale.
Exactly. Then there are alternative animal models, like using zebrafish embryos. They develop very rapidly, they're transparent, and they share many relevant genes and biological pathways with humans, making them useful for screening.
Zebrafish, interesting. What else?
Computational toxicology and virtual models. This involves using computer algorithms and models to predict toxicity based on a chemical structure or known properties, or even creating virtual models of complex systems like the fetal blood-brain barrier to simulate how chemicals might interact with it. And another important framework is adverse outcome pathways, or AOPs.
AOPs?
Yeah, AOPs are conceptual frameworks that link a molecular initiating event, like a chemical binding, to a receptor through a series of key biological steps to an adverse health outcome at the individual or population level. They help organize existing knowledge and guide testing strategies.
So these NAMs are about getting more information faster and maybe smarter.
That's the goal. What makes these so exciting is how they're transforming toxicology. They're helping us prioritize which chemicals need the most urgent attention, screen chemicals more efficiently, and ultimately inform regulatory decisions much more quickly and hopefully more proactively before widespread exposure occurs.
But even with NAMs, there's still more research needed, right? Where do we need to focus?
Oh, absolutely. The work is far from over. We still need to really pinpoint the precise mechanisms of neurotoxicity, especially for those complex real-world mixtures. We need to keep improving exposure assessment methods, developing better biomarkers using sophisticated modeling. We definitely need more longitudinal studies that follow individuals from early life over many years or decades to track exposures and health outcomes.
Connecting those dots we talked about earlier.
Exactly. We need to dig deeper into those gene-environment interactions, who is most susceptible and why. We need much clearer answers on the direct links between things like pesticides and air pollution and the rising rates of neurodevelopmental disorders like ASD and ADHD. We need to deepen our understanding of climate change's neurological impacts, especially the long-term consequences. And of course, we need to continue developing, validating, and integrating those NAMs into regulatory frameworks.
So a lot still to learn and do.
A tremendous amount. But the evidence we do have is already compelling. Our environment profoundly influences neurological health throughout our entire lives. From the air we breathe, the water we drink, the chemicals we encounter. These diverse factors seem to converge on common damaging pathways within the brain. But crucially, there's another side to this story. And it's actually a really powerful one.
Okay.
If these neurological problems arise from environmental factors.
And they're preventable, that's what you said earlier.
Precisely. Neurological diseases arising significantly from environmental factors are, by definition, preventable.
And this is where the real power lies, isn't it? This isn't just about understanding the problem, it's about empowerment. It means we can potentially do something. So what does this all mean for you, the listener, hearing all this?
Well, firstly, it suggests that policy and regulation play a huge foundational role. Things like limiting pollutants at the source, strengthening chemical safety testing requirements, and really integrating climate change impacts and adaptation into our public health strategies. These systemic changes are critical.
Okay, so supporting those kinds of policies is one thing.
Yes. And for you, it also means considering how you can support public health initiatives in your own community. Things promoting clean energy, ensuring safe water infrastructure, advocating for healthier community design with green spaces and safe walking paths. And on a personal level, it means being aware of potential protective measures in your own life, maybe making informed dietary choices, using air filters if you live in a polluted area, reducing exposure where you can.
And for doctors.
For healthcare providers, it really highlights the growing importance of considering environmental factors. Asking about environmental exposure histories during patient assessments could become increasingly valuable.
Okay, so here's a final thought to leave you with. Think about this. If our early life environment, the air a baby breathes, the chemicals they encounter can potentially prime their nervous system for disease decades down the line. What responsibility do we have collectively to create a healthier neurological future for the next generation, starting right now?
That's a profound question.
It really demands a comprehensive strategy, doesn't it? Where government, industry, communities, and individuals, all of us play a part. That's our deep dive into environmental factors and neurological health. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive. Until next time, keep digging for knowledge.
Concierge Care, providing world-class, personalized care for patients and members. Taking a proactive approach by offering its free digital health clinic for anyone in need of these services. Reach out to us via our website, www.health.conciergecare.net, or give us a phone call at 786-809-2345.